History as it happens, October 25th, 2022. Flirting with Armageddon.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
Beginning this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and
We got Friday night got a message from Khrushchev which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba.
60 years after humanity's closest brush with nuclear war, a Russian leader is threatening to push the button. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 ended without bloodshed, with a deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Today, Vladimir Putin says he's not bluffing about nuking Ukraine, as his war on his U.S.-backed neighbor escalates. What is the way out? That's next with Max Hastings as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Today, President Putin threatened to use even more deadly weapons.
President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime.
It looked as if I was writing about ancient history. But yes, Putin's assault and rape of Ukraine has given the whole thing an immediacy that I could never have imagined. Now, we have to be clear, history never exactly repeats itself, so we don't want to draw too many parallels, but I believe that there are important lessons that we can learn.
Nikita Khrushchev was known for his bluster and theatrics.
Весь мир знает, что самая империалистическая держава – это Соединенные Штаты Америки.
In speeches such as this one at the United Nations in 1960,
Об этом все воробьи на крышах чирикают, что самая империалистическая...
he pounded his fist to punctuate words designed to get a rise out of his audience. And one time, Khrushchev was said to have brandished his shoe and threatened to pound a table with it to protest a speech criticizing the USSR. Although no photos or videos of that incident exist, if it indeed happened.
Барышня уже, наверное, десяток имеет детей.
2 years later, in 1962, the Soviet premier backed up his bluster with a move that brought the world to the edge of catastrophe. Americans learned of it on October 22nd when they turned on their black and white TVs to watch President Kennedy tell them what a U-2 spy plane had photographed in Cuba.
The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba.
By the time Kennedy delivered that stunning news, he and his advisors were already 6 days into what historians now call the Cuban Missile Crisis. And today we have a pretty good idea of just how close the world came to nuclear war because of the tapes, the audio recordings of the XCOM meetings, where top civilian and military men proposed the bombing and possibly the invasion of Cuba. Here is Defense Secretary Robert McNamara on Tuesday, October 16th.
We could carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. We would be ready for the start of such an airstrike within a matter of days. If it were absolutely essential, it could be done almost literally within a matter of hours. I believe the chiefs would prefer that it be deferred for a matter of days. But we initial day if necessary. Presumably there would be some political discussions taking place either just before the airstrike or both before and during. In any event, we would be prepared following the airstrike for an air invasion, both by air and by sea.
Had Kennedy listened, had he ordered an attack, it may have provoked a Soviet response with nukes. But to humanity's enduring appreciation, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached a deal instead, although the details were not publicized at the time. Kennedy did discuss them in a private call with former President Eisenhower during the crisis, the audio of which is now available to researchers.
General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got, Friday night, got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba. We then got a message, that public one, the next morning, in which he said he would do that if we withdrew our missiles from Turkey.
In the end, the Soviets withdrew from Cuba. The U.S. took its Jupiter missiles out of Turkey and promised not to invade Cuba again, as it did in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Today, 60 Octobers later, another Russian leader is saying he's not bluffing when it comes to pushing the button, and now the world is left to decipher what's really going on in Vladimir Putin's head. Would he launch tactical nuclear weapons at Ukraine, as his army desperately tries to hold on to a legally annexed territory in his illegal war against his neighbor?
Again, just today, President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime.
President Biden at the United Nations. And in private off-camera remarks recently, the president invoked 1962 when he said, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." Biden was also quoted as saying, "I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon." So what can the crisis of 1962 tell us about how this situation might end? Who better to ask than one of the world's preeminent military historians, the author of a brand new book, The Abyss, Nuclear Crisis Cuba, 1962. Sir Max Hastings, welcome back to the podcast.
Lovely to be with you again, Martin.
It's always an honor to have you joining us from the United Kingdom, and congratulations on the book, your 30th book.
Well, I don't know whether it'll be my last. I'll have to think about that. But the great thing is I always remember one of my fellow historians, somebody saying about him that he wrote some great books to start with, and then they got worse and worse. And I don't want anybody saying that about me. So I'd rather stop before my readers stop.
Well, you already have a head start on me. I'm 30 books behind you as an author, so I got to get cracking on that. Well, I know I've learned quite a bit from reading your work over the years. So, you know, Max, I have an old friend who used to ask me, "Why do you keep reading about old subjects like the First World War, whatever it might be?" He'd say, "What is there to learn at this point that you haven't read already 1,000 times?" Well, I think I know how you might answer him. Here we are with the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the subject is still fresh, right, as Putin threatens Ukraine with nuclear weapons. What do you think of that?
When I started out, it looked as if I was writing about ancient history. But yes, Putin's assault and rape of Ukraine has given the whole thing an immediacy that I could never have imagined. Now, we have to be clear, history never exactly repeats itself, so we don't want to draw too many parallels, but I believe that there are important lessons that we can learn. The good news is that in 1962, the planet sincerely looked in the eyes of many people around the tables in the White House and the Kremlin and around the world as if it was threatened with extinction by general war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, this is still a regional war, but it's a regional war with nuclear weapons. And as long as those nuclear weapons are out there, and of course, Putin was almost daily making threats to use them, which I do not believe that we can treat simply as bluff. And as long as we have in the Kremlin a very unstable figure, whom I suggest in my book is less predictable, less stable, subject to fewer restraints than was Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader in 1962. then the risks are very great. And there's another element. In the missile crisis, although, yes, the world seemed to be threatened with extinction, almost nobody died. One American U-2 pilot, a number of accidental aircrew casualties, but the whole thing stopped before the shooting started, although the US Army and the US Navy and the US Air Force, above all, were panting for war. Now, in this case, tens of thousands of people have already died as a result of Putin's aggression. And this makes it much, much more difficult to see what sort of deal Ukraine's President Zelensky or America's President Biden might conceivably be able to offer Putin that would not reward his aggression. So, on the one hand, yes, the danger of general war is a little further away than it was in 1962. But on the other hand, it's harder, I think, to see the way out of this one.
Agreed. And we'll return to the current situation in Ukraine at the end of the interview, because the Cuban Missile Crisis is an example of the law of unintended consequences from miscalculation, miscommunication, or maybe the absence of communication. The simple fact that no world leader can possibly have a full grasp of all events as they unfold. Intelligence gathering is never perfect. And to your point in your first answer there is this notion that nuclear war would never happen because no human being really wants it. But that overlooks the reality that people make mistakes.
I've written another book about 1914 and how the world went to war. In 1914, none of the belligerents wanted general war. They didn't want a big war. But Germany and Austria-Hungary willed a small war to crush Serbia, which then seemed a completely marginal little European country. But they lost control of events, and you ended up with World War I. Exactly the same was true in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that some historians do argue today that because neither Khrushchev nor John F. Kennedy in the White House wanted nuclear war, that therefore it wasn't going to happen. But first of all, there were a terrifying number of people out there who did want nuclear war, or certainly wanted war, starting with the US Chiefs of Staff. And secondly, the risk of accidents of subordinate commanders who were responsible for nuclear weapons simply losing it. There was a well-known episode in which a Soviet submarine commander, 600 miles out in the Atlantic, being harassed by US warships in the middle of the crisis, and he lost it completely down there, several hundred feet below the Atlantic. He said he thought war had already broken out on the surface and started to demand that the ship's nuclear torpedoes were armed. And of course, the US Navy had no inkling that these ships, or these boats, one should call them, were armed with nuclear torpedoes. Now, everybody calmed him down, and it doesn't look from the evidence that we have that the nuclear torpedo was ever armed. But nonetheless, this was an example of how subordinate commanders notionally did have power to start something very scary. So all the time there's this risk. And I think one of the most telling conversations in the whole business. The crisis began in October 1962, when on the morning of the 16th, America's national security advisor goes into John F. Kennedy's bedroom in the White House, and he says, we have photographic evidence that the Soviets have secretly installed nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba. And John F. Kennedy's first remark in response to that, he said, we're probably going to have to bomb them. 2 hours later, when he had the so-called executive committee of the National Security Council gathered around a table in the White House, he thought some more about this. And he already, thank goodness for the planet, had begun to see the implications of getting into any sort of shooting unless you had to. But other people around the table that morning had not. So the way one of those first conversations in the White House went, and remember, we're not speculating about this. We have the transcripts, we have the audio tapes, which make absolutely riveting reading. And first questions around the table, well, if we bomb and invade Cuba, as the armed forces want to do, then what happens next? And somebody said, well, almost certainly the Soviets seize West Berlin, which was then an enclave, an Allied enclave in the middle of communist East Germany. And Robert Kennedy said, well, what happens then? And Maxwell Taylor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's most senior soldier, he says, we go to general war if it's in the interests of ours. And Jack Kennedy says, the president says, you mean nuclear exchange? And Maxwell Taylor says, incredibly, almost insouciantly, he says, guess you have to. And Kennedy says, and this was a reflection of the wisdom he displayed all that week, which I think represents his best claim to greatness. He said, whatever we do in the days ahead, we have to do everything conceivable to avoid nuclear exchange, which represents the final failure.
Now the question really is as to what action we take, which lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure.
Now, this was the President of the United States as one of his most important statesmen, the final failure. And all through that week, sure, he had moments when he lurched a little bit towards the notion of war. But basically, he realized that a local war in Cuba almost certainly was going to turn into a general war with the Soviet Union. And I think one of the most important lessons of the crisis is that Kennedy displayed absolutely the right mix of resolution in being determined to get the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, but also caution, because he realized that in the nuclear age, you can't mess about with nuclear armed powers. And one thing, I personally think the Biden administration is handling Ukraine very well today, but I'm a bit scared, very scared, in fact, of some of the very bellicose rhetoric of some British politicians who say, oh, we must call Putin's bluff. The war must go on until the last Russian is out of Crimea or out of the Donbass. Well, this isn't our war. This, I'm sorry to say, is British politicians playing their own games with Ukrainian lives.
That's right. It doesn't even have to go
that
nuclear. It could still destroy Ukraine if the war goes on for years.
I think this mixture of resolution and caution, that's what Kennedy showed, and that's what I think Biden is displaying today.
So the Cuban Missile Crisis went on for 13 days, mid to late October. October 18th was a really important date. But before we get to that, let's go with a little context here. Why was the Soviet Union deploying nuclear missiles in bases across Cuba during the summer of 1962?
In 1962, the Cold War was very cold indeed. And a lot of people in the West had a wildly exaggerated idea of the Soviet Union's power. Not only the obvious, its possession of nuclear weapons, and it very much exaggerated the Soviet Union's nuclear strength, it also thought that the Soviet Union was a genuine competitor with the United States economically and for the sort of future of the world, that communism might take over. And economists like J.K. Galbraith and Paul Samuelson, amazingly today, they were saying then that they thought within a generation that the Russian economy might overtake the American economy. Well, what we now know, and Nikita Khrushchev knew then, was that the Soviet Union was a basket case, that at a time when Americans were eating steak and looking at color televisions, that there was bread rationing in areas of the Soviet Union, and those Russians who were privileged enough to have televisions were looking at tiny black and white sets through screens that they had to look at through water-filled magnifiers. Now, Khrushchev, his game, he wanted to beat his chest and say to the world, look what a huge, mighty power the Soviet Union is, even though he knew this wasn't true. And so he came up with this. He was always, it rankled with him, that the United States had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey, right across the Black Sea from his own dacha, in Italy and in Britain. And one day at his dacha on the Black Sea, he says to his defense minister, Marshal Malinowski, why don't we throw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants? And his proposal was to plant these nuclear missiles in Cuba secretly, and then in November to make a great speech to the United Nations announcing this to the world. Now, incredibly, Soviet generals went along with this, and they said, yeah, we can hide the missiles until November under palm trees. Well, you've got to be a nutter to think that that was going to work. But that's what they set about doing. And what is remarkable was that US intelligence, although it knew the Russians were up to something, it didn't get the exact message. For instance, CIA thought there were 5,000 or 6,000 Soviet personnel in Cuba. By October, there were 43,000. Although the CIA did cotton onto, late, but nonetheless ahead of everybody else, onto the idea of nuclear missiles. What they didn't know was that in addition to the strategic missiles in Cuba, that the Russians had also deployed tactical nuclear weapons. One of the reasons I believe the crisis was much more dangerous than some people thought then and think now was that if the Americans had gone ahead and invaded as the armed forces chiefs wanted, I cannot believe that the commanders on the spot would have sat there, taken terrific casualties, been trashed by US Marines and Navy and Air Force without using those nuclear weapons over which they had absolute control.
Khrushchev also is viewing the deployment as a defensive move. Now, I'm not sure there's a difference between offensive and defensive nuclear weapons, but the history here, there was the Bay of Pigs. You mentioned how these were cold years during the Cold War. He, in his mind, is defending Cuba against American aggression, right?
That is true. And Khrushchev, although very few Americans saw it at the time, funnily enough, John F. Kennedy did see it at the time. Khrushchev had a case that legally there was no more reason why Cuba as a sovereign nation shouldn't choose to host Soviet nuclear weapons than that Turkey or Britain shouldn't choose to host American ones. But that leaves out the politics that the US has always had something of a colonialist attitude to Cuba, that because the island is in its backyard, many Americans have always felt they had this right to decide what goes on in Cuba. Now, when John F. Kennedy made his big speech to the American people 6 days after the crisis began, when he first knew of the missiles, Theodore Sorensen, his counsel and speechwriter, he freely testified afterwards that in the president's speech telling the American people and the world about the missiles, he went big on the fact that the Soviet Union had lied about the deployment. They kept saying they weren't deploying missiles, about the secrecy in which they'd done it. And they went big on the deceit.
This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. The size of this undertaking makes clear that it has been planned for some months. Yet only last month, after I had made clear the distinction between any introduction of ground-to-ground missiles and the existence of defensive anti-aircraft missiles, the Soviet government publicly stated on September 11th that, and I quote, "The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes," unquote. That there is, and I quote the Soviet government, "there is no need for the Soviet government to shift its weapons for a retaliatory blow to any other country, for instance, Cuba," unquote. And that, and I quote the government, "the Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union," unquote. That statement was false.
Because they knew that the Soviet Union actually had a legal and moral case for being able to deploy those weapons. But the one thing was for sure, Kennedy recognized this, but he also recognized all the time he's thinking of his re-election campaign in '64. He knew that conservative America would eat him for breakfast if he allowed those missiles to remain. That in the mood of that time, in the depths of the Cold War, that John F. Kennedy, whom many conservative Americans mocked as weak, as an appeaser, as soft on the Reds, he had to be seen to be tough. So one of the most important things to say about this crisis, it was not strategic, although many Americans thought that it was, in that America was not much more dangerous as a result of the missiles being placed in Cuba. This was a political crisis. And what was for sure, and this we can see clearly, Khrushchev deliberately put those missiles there to challenge the United States in its own backyard. So it was not surprising most of America went off the deep end when this happened.
And the midterm elections were coming up the next month as well, because the missiles did escape detection until October. And something that makes today's situation more dangerous, generally speaking, is that leaders are under so much pressure today to respond quickly to events because you can't keep something secret like this for 6 days, right? How was the Kennedy administration able to sit on this information that there were missiles in Cuba for 6 full days before going public with it?
It was absolutely amazing that the secret was kept for those 6 days until Kennedy broadcast to the American people. And as you suggest just now, you couldn't get away with doing it nowadays. But people were, even journalists, the whole idea of patriotism was very important in those days. And when the White House press office called the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post and asked them when they were starting to get some hint of this story to play it soft for another couple of days, they went along with this. They did it in a way I don't think they would now. And of course, the whole 24-hour news cycle wasn't there, and there weren't so many sources of information. You didn't have satellite phones, you didn't have all sorts of things. But one thing I'm sorry to say is the same today as it was then, that I'm always a skeptic about intelligence, that intelligence is a wonderful thing and all governments need to take it seriously. And your satellite cameras can show you Russian troop movements. U-2 photography showed those missiles in Cuba in 1962. But what intelligence couldn't do then and can't do now is see inside the minds of the other side. One of the things that strikes me, and I've gone big on in my book, is through those 13 days, some of the smartest people in America sat around the table in the White House trying to figure out what the Soviets were doing, and almost always getting it wrong. For example, at first, quite a few of the people around the table thought that the Cuban move was simply a deception. Everybody was then fixated on Berlin and fear that the Soviets were going to take out Berlin. They sincerely thought this might be a move, the Cuban move might be intended to divert American attention before a big action against Berlin. Then, when a U-2 is shot down over Cuba, and at the White House table, when they hear about this, somebody says they fired the first shot, it was taken for granted that this was a deliberate escalation by the Kremlin. Actually, it was nothing of the sort. It was a rogue local commander in Cuba who decided he'd had enough of Americans flying overhead. And Khrushchev went mad when he heard about it because he'd already made the decision they were going to have to get the missiles out. But it was taken for granted in the White House that this was. And so what is now known, the last Saturday of the crisis, which we now know to be the last Saturday, was known then as Black Saturday because so many things seemed to happen with the U-2 shoot down, US Navy playing cat and mouse with these Soviet submarines, with a U-2 out of Alaska getting lost over the Soviet Union and being chased by MiG fighters. All these things are coming together. And that day, far from the White House realizing that Khrushchev was about to throw in his hand, which he was, they all thought that this was the nearest they'd come to war. So it is quite scary how you've got access to the best intelligence, and yet you know nothing about the mind of the other side. And I have to say today, I don't believe that President Biden and his people know any more about what Vladimir Putin is doing or might do next than we do. Because seeing inside the minds of the other side is very tough.
And of course, people change their minds day to day in a crisis. What they might think is a right move Monday is something different on Tuesday. And you're taking what you believe is a defensive measure, but the other side views it as escalatory. So Kennedy decides on a quarantine. He didn't want to call it an embargo because that's an act of war, a quarantine to prevent any more Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. But wasn't it on October 18th? This was the closest the world came to nuclear war when Kennedy rejects the suggestion or the recommendation by his military advisors to invade Cuba because those advisors believe there are only a few thousand Soviet forces on the island when there were actually 40,000?
I'm not sure that I would pick out that date of the 18th, that essentially the US military all the way through were calling for war because they knew as a result of this extraordinary Soviet defector, not defector, he became a double agent inside the Soviet intelligence machine, who told them, given them in great detail intelligence about Soviet nuclear capability. Everybody in Washington now knew that Soviet nuclear capability, far from being on a par with that of the United States had a 17-to-1 superiority in nuclear warheads.
Well, Kennedy liked the missile gap. It was a lie, really, wasn't it?
It was a lie. It was a deliberate election gamble. one of his cheapest stunts. And the chiefs of staff were absolutely confident. They talked about, I think, Max Taylor, that when he was asked how long it would take to clear out Cuba, he reckoned about 3 weeks, and then the whole thing would be over. And when you look at what happened in Vietnam or Iraq and so on and so forth, it's ridiculous. But what we have to remember about the soldiers, about the warriors, the airmen's position, this was the generation, all those generals and admirals, they had been the victors of 1945. They'd seen the United States lead the Grand Alliance to a total victory over Germany and Japan in 1945. They were still thinking victory, and what they wanted was a victory over the Soviet Union. Now, what we can now see, and I hate the word victory, and I get really cross with people today who say we need a victory over Russia today. We want to get Russia out of the Ukraine, and we want to see Putin humbled, and we hope that he falls as a result of his aggression. But I think to talk about rubbing the Russians' noses in it, one's got to be very careful, because the Russians in a corner, I do believe that they may be capable of nuclear use. We have to do everything possible to avoid escalation into a nuclear conflict, which is a real possibility. But those guys in 1962, the military, they were hell-bent on victory. And even after Nikita Khrushchev had written a letter which was broadcast over Moscow radio on the last day of the crisis, on the Sunday, the 28th of October, announcing that the missiles would be removed, that the chiefs of staff sent another formal recommendation to the president saying this was all just a Russian racket, a Russian stunt, and demanding that the next day the US armed forces bombed and then invaded Cuba. The chief of naval operations said, "We have been had," which caused Kennedy to say, the military are mad. And mad they were. Now, today, I happen to think that the US military, and for that matter, the other Western military, are much more sensible today than they were then. But that victory complex in 1962 was a real factor. And
well, if the Soviets had responded with nuclear weapons to an invasion, we might not be talking.
That's just it. No, I think there would have been escalation. I think we also have to remember, if you look at the roll call of presidents who succeeded John F. Kennedy, I'm very doubtful how many of them would have rejected the very strong military advice to go to war, which is what they were calling for. I think Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan would almost certainly have accepted the American advice to bomb and invade with untold consequences. Other presidents, yes, might have been more cautious, but it is scary to think. And today, I know that in the United States, John F. Kennedy is a very controversial figure, partly because of his treatment of women. But I personally think that whatever his huge flaws, and they were huge character flaws, that 13 days of the missile crisis, I think, was his finest hour and represents his claim to greatness. And I think the world has cause to be enormously grateful to him for our survival.
Well, maybe the moral of the story here, and this applies to what's going on in Eastern Europe right now, is that you can bluster publicly, as Khrushchev did, but there has to be communication and a willingness to maybe even lose face or be willing to risk it. And that's what happened here, right? Kennedy and Khrushchev, through intermediaries, were communicating privately, and they were able to de-escalate the situation. There is no communication today between the United States and Moscow.
I'm not sure I really agree about that. I think communication was very poor between Moscow and Washington. What's remarkable is because all the way through, right up to the end, Khrushchev kept blustering and sounding defiant in private as well as in public. I don't think the communication was there. But where you're absolutely right, today the communication is very poor. Now, I think we all have cause to hope that today the White House is privately warning the Kremlin in the strongest terms that if there's any nuclear use, that NATO, which really means the United States, will respond with devastating force. I personally believe that something like taking out the Russian Black Sea Fleet with conventional weapons, I hasten to add, I don't think that the United States either should or will deliver a threat of a nuclear counterstrike. But I do think that the United States should threaten the use of devastating force, which could do irreparable, stupendous damage to the Russian armed forces. And I hope that message is getting through to the Kremlin. Khrushchev was under more control from his own presidium in the Kremlin than Putin appears to be at home. Now, none of us know. Of course, the possibility is always there that Putin will be toppled, perhaps very soon. We don't know. But Putin appears to be answerable to no one other than his own cronies and the gangster clique he has around him.
But in 1962, in the final analysis, Sir Max, it was a negotiated settlement. The United States agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey and never invade Cuba. Communication may have been poor, and of course, because of technology, it took a long time for coded telegrams to cross the ocean, right? But in the end, they did agree to a negotiated settlement. And
But there was the basis for a deal. I think I said earlier that Jack Kennedy saw and actually said at a meeting of ExCom quite early in the crisis that he thought that the American missiles in Turkey, which anyway the Pentagon had decided were strategically irrelevant in the age when Polaris submarine missiles were becoming the big deal in nuclear deterrence. And the idea of the United States giving a formal guarantee not to mount further military operations against Cuba and to remove the missiles, Kennedy saw the basis of a deal. Now today, it's much more difficult because it's so hard to see the deal. If you say to Putin, well, you can keep what you've already taken, then you're rewarding his monstrous aggression. But it's reckoned that the Russians have done about $500 billion worth of damage to Ukraine. There's not a cat's chance in hell of getting them to pay reparations for that unspeakable damage. Now, I personally believe, and I've been accused by some people in Britain of being an appeaser for saying this, I think in the end, the Russians will hang on to Crimea, but it's much more difficult to see the deal. And always remember that President Zelensky has to be the principal party in any negotiation than it was in 1962. So that's the hard part. And what I'm afraid, and I think most of the people I respect in the military believe, is that there's got to be a lot more killing and dying, a lot more fighting before the two sides realize that there's got to be some sort of negotiation.
Powerful countries lose wars, but they can take years to lose wars, and that could be what's happening right now with Russia. And I tend to agree with you. I'm no military analyst, but prying Crimea away from Russia might be impossible. So my final question to you, my final thought, Sir Max, is, and this is a controversial idea here in the United States, whether the White House needs to pressure Ukraine to negotiate when it's their country that's been invaded.
I think any pressure has got to be extremely sensitively applied. And I think one's got to pace this. At the moment, the greatest danger is that Putin thinks he can win this struggle because he believes that the West's will crumble, especially the will of the Europeans, if we get a cold winter and people's lights start going out. So the first priority before anybody pressures anybody to do anything is to get it into Putin's head that Western will is not going to crumble. And I say, I do think the United States, I believe that Europeans should display greater, very public gratitude to the United States. We've been reminded in this crisis that for the umpteenth time since World War II, the United States is the vital force. If it were left to the Europeans, Ukraine and President Zelensky would be toast by now. They'd have lost because it's only American armaments and American support that's made it possible to defy Putin. So the first priority is to show the resolution, to convince Moscow that there ain't going to be no Western give. But I do think that downstream, that President Putin, and that seems to be the mood music one's getting from everything I read coming out of Washington, that downstream there is a very private recognition that sometime President Zelensky may have to be encouraged to negotiate, but I don't think that time is yet.
Well, as we thank Max Hastings, here are a couple of news stories to consider that are related to what we've been discussing here. First, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Russian counterpart, just the second known call since the Russian invasion in late February, on the subject of communication between the two sides, or lack thereof. And in the U.S. House, 30 liberal Democrats are now urging President Biden to shift his strategy on Ukraine and pursue direct negotiations with Russia to try to find a way out of this morass before it goes nuclear. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about what we were supposed to deal with in this episode, but sometimes the schedule gets juggled, so my apologies. Coming up next, we're going to talk about Pat Buchanan's lasting, enduring influence on the modern GOP. as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.